Very good morning again to those of you who've joined us just recently. We're going to start this morning's session with Richard Lewney, who's the are you the chair, Richard, the chair of Cambridge Economic.
Yeah,
I can do that. I can do that.
Econometrics.
I could say this morning. Econometrics. Thank you, Richard. Apologies. Cambridge Econometrics. And Simeon Mitchell, who's introduced himself earlier on in the consultation, but just in case you haven't met him, is the Secretary for Church and Society at the United Reformed Church's mission team. You might want to speak a bit more about your role, but for now. And Victoria Turner, who's a PhD student, well, almost, yeah, right at the end, nearly there, at the University of Edinburgh. And again, might want to speak a bit more about where she's been and the journey that she's been on. But thank you so much, all three of you. And it's great to have you in person, all three of you. It's been unusual for this for this consultation to have everybody in the room who's in one session. That's great. So the idea is if each of you can present your paper in turn, sort of 5 minutes-ish, and then we'll invite comments, reflections, questions from people online and from people in the room. But thank you. If we start with you, Richard.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Lindsay, and thanks for the invitation. Everyone, good to be here. I'm just going to say a little bit about myself, because I think that it explains a bit where the paper, why what is in the paper is in there. So I work for this small company consultancy, Cambridge Econometrics. And about 30 years ago, we started developing models to look at the economic impact of climate mitigation policy. So that seems like a long time ago, 30 years. But the point I'm making is really that concern about climate was obviously around then, maybe not quite as prevalent as it is now. There wasn't so much evidence of the effects of warming, but that was where we were, and we had a sort of heart for it, and we grabbed sort of money from wherever we could to develop stuff. And over about 5 or 10 years it took us before we were in a position to provide this tool to policy makers. So we do a lot of work, for example, for the European Commission, who have, I guess it's fair to say, led government efforts. They've been at the kind of forefront of government efforts to kind of have more ambitious targets. There's not a lot of theology in my paper, and I'm really glad that Simeon has the theology that I take for granted when starting my paper. But I'll say what theology there is. So sometimes when I've been in a forum, I've asked the question of the audience. I've said, here are 2 statements. One is climate change is principally driven by human activity and is a severe threat, possibly an existential threat to the world, certainly to life, our life at least. That's one statement. And the other statement is governments should do the minimum necessary. They should be restricted to do the minimum necessary to support society. And it's quite hard to find 2 people who agree with both of those statements. They usually are all about, yes, climate really matters, and therefore government needs to do something, or they're all about government should be restricted, and climate, it's overstated. Okay, people overstate the risks. And if you think about it, that's very odd, because the first statement is a scientific statement, right? I mean, I'm not a scientist, but it's about the science. Listen to the scientists. And the other is about politics. It's the kind of traditional left-right thing. So my point is that I take as my text, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And I don't just mean that in the sense of people deliberately distorting the evidence to suit their own vested interest, although that happens. I'm more concerned about how all of us are influenced by the sort of bubble that we're in and by what our interests are. So we tend to listen more to the arguments that support us, and that's obviously really obvious in social media. So the heart I take to be our moral compass, and then our moral compass gets distorted. And I think in the matter of climate, that the people in my bubble who are in this room and beyond are on the side of the right. But I wouldn't say we're always on the side of the right. It's, you know, we have to recognise how we're influenced. So in the paper, I try to present about the economics and make the case for why why mainstream economics has tended to overstate the cost of doing anything about global warming and to understate the benefits of it. And some of that is not terribly technical, but it's kind of in the world of it's definitely in the world of economics, and why I think there are better ways. And the guy who got the Nobel Prize, this is the best that mainstream economics had to offer. William Nordhaus, about 4 or 5 years ago, got the Nobel Prize for his work, and admittedly, at least he did something. But still, his conclusion was that the optimum would be to allow global warming of about 3.5 degrees, which is just, you know, to anybody else. You see how far you had to go. Okay. But the other point in my paper that I make is about, so that's sort of challenging the economics, challenging the politics. And that is that there are a lot of technological solutions out there. By no means everything that we need to do is instantly available, but quite a lot is. You know, insulating houses is not a difficult technology, okay, and that's really important to do. And I see the challenges as more political and social, and in particular, and I guess this is something that Victoria picks up, the impact of, let's say, higher energy prices, or the impact of the mitigation. The impact of climate change is being felt by the poor, but the impact of mitigation is also felt by the poor, and that they're the least able to adapt, and we've seen that with high energy prices recently. And so my point here is that I think people in the European Commission are most concerned that what will hold them back, because they are a sort of technocratic institution, sort of trying to drag governments with them in a not entirely democratic way, what will hold them back is the rise of right-wing populism, and, you know, governments of Poland or Hungary, or movements like the AfD or Daily Mail in this country. And so my concern is how we engage with that. And because I'm a sort of lay preacher, I was looking at the text in the lectionary for this Sunday, and it just struck me that maybe, as well as protesting, as well as shouting, we might need to engage with the sinners and the colluders and the collaborators to try and win, not the people way on the other side, but the people in the middle to the just one side of the argument. Because it seems to me that we can't afford the luxury of polarization. That's what I'm saying. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. Leave my comments, but thank you very much for that. That's really helpful. Simeon.
Well, just to kind of locate what I'm going to say in the paper that I've offered, it's not entirely my work. It draws on the work of the Joint Public Issues team, the team that I'm a part of and currently the team leader of. A team that works on behalf of the URC and the Methodist and the Baptist churches in our kind of political engagement and our reflection on issues of justice and peace in the world. And for many years, as a team, we've had a focus on issues around poverty and marginalisation in the UK and globally, and about the climate crisis. And increasingly, we found ourselves bumping up against a common issue, and both of those two challenges, which is around the economy. And so we chose to develop a program of work around thinking about the economy as well, because it seems so central to both of those concerns for human welfare and for the welfare of our planet. Yesterday, in one of our sessions, Matt Plen's paper reminded us that the work of interpretation and of discernment is better done in community, the changes that I now want to make to the paper that I wrote and its language in the light of the discussions we've had over the last couple of days are an illustration of the fact that it's a work in progress and evolution, and there are things in that I now want to change, but it is what it is. We've also already heard the phrase with which I wanted to start, which was, "It's the economy, stupid." mentioned in this consultation, and I don't want to denigrate anyone who has a concern about responding to the climate crisis with that pejorative term, but I do want to argue that the economy should be much more central to our understanding of how we've got to where we are, and also how we might begin to get out of the mess we're in. We've been sold the idea that our current economic system is either a sort of neutral technical mechanism that is best left to the experts to just keep it running, or something to which there is no alternative anyway, rather than an expression of moral and social and political ideas in which we all have a stake and probably all have a view. And also the reality that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, in the words of Herman Daly. So the paper that I put together sets out 4 grounding theological principles which I think should shape our approach to thinking about the economy. They're fairly obvious points, but I think it is worth stating them. The first is that we live in a world of plenty, and so our starting point is abundance rather than scarcity, and that's in stark contrast to many economic models. The second of the points is that we are made for community. So we need an economic system, but that economic system should be an expression of our common life. It takes us back to the origins of the word economy, which is about house or household. It's where we live together. It's the way that we live together. The third point is that God desires the flourishing of all life. Jesus promises life in abundance, life in all its fullness. But that flourishing is not just about individuals, it's about communities flourishing. And I think we're increasingly recognizing that for human beings, that flourishing can only come in the context of the flourishing of all creation as well. So we need in our structures and systems, our common life, to seek the flourishing of individuals, community, and of the planet. And the fourth point is one which we've touched on quite a number of times over the last couple of days, which is about the fact that we'll be judged on the choices that we make, especially those of us who have more choices to make. Many people in our current economic system don't have much choice about anything. But for those who do, we will be judged, and those who have the power will particularly be held accountable for if they're complicit in systems which create and which perpetuate injustice. So holding those 4 things in mind, I turn to look at our current economic system, free market capitalist system in various forms in most of the Western world. And I pull out 3 features of that system which we believe are driving our current ecological crisis, as well as causing social injustice and other injustices too. The first feature is the inbuilt need for perpetual growth. Again, we've talked about that a bit already. Being based on the pursuit of profit on capital or repayment of debt with interest, that's inherent to the system. And if you look at the data, since industrialization, that growth has been very tightly coupled to rises in levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide. So we don't currently have a way of growing economically which doesn't involve increasing CO2 emissions. It's, people are trying to do it, but and maybe Richard will give me some examples of places where it might be possible, but the big picture, it's just not possible. Economist Kenneth Goulding says, I love this quote, "Anyone who believes that economic growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist." Kenneth Goulding is an economist. Setting growth as an objective in itself is simply aiming for more without asking the vital question, more of what? What are we hoping will grow? What are we looking to see grow? And as we reflect on all of that about growth, we hear Jesus's warnings about the accumulation of possessions, the dangers of that ringing in our ears. So growth is one big problem. A second issue is about how the economy assesses value, and GDP is the measure that is most commonly used, widely used to assess the size of an economy and the direction of an economy. It's a deeply flawed measure. It takes no account of whether economic activity offers any value to society or indeed of its environmental impact. We might contrast that with a Christian understanding of where our value comes from and what our value is drawn from, the inherent worth and value of each individual and the contribution that they make. And then the third of my kind of concerns about the current system is around its understanding of freedom. It elevates the neoliberal economic model, elevates the pursuit of individual freedom and the freedom of the market to operate at the cost of many other freedoms, but without imposing corresponding responsibilities. So the resulting liberalisation of economies, privatisation, deregulation of economies over the last 40 years have left governments with very few levers to address the climate crisis or indeed social injustice caused by economic systems. We might contrast that model which elevates market freedom with the systems of restraint and balance that are set out in the Sabbath and the Jubilee laws in the Old Testament and in many other places too. So where do we start in seeking the transformation of our economic system? I set out some ideas here, but I think this is the area which needs most development. As we've noted already, we are so enmeshed and embedded in this system, it's very hard to think beyond it. So I think it needs to start by believing that change is possible and question those assumptions that underlie some of the notions in our economy, such as the notion which is widely adopted across the political spectrum that growth is always to be welcomed and pursued, and that requires educating ourselves and building our confidence to engage and to challenge. Secondly, I think we need to reclaim the idea that economic goals should be the subject of civic discussion and, most importantly, democratic decision-making. This is the realm of governments. This is what governments should be there to think about and to do. And that requires us to engage with political structures about this. We need to draw on that biblical insight that the undoubted abundance of the world needs to be managed with human restraint, and that requires us to get into advocacy. And then we need to develop new economic measures that reflect what we actually value as people, as society. And that requires fresh thinking, and I'm grateful that there are people around me who are doing some of that thinking. I conclude by saying that there's no certainty that taking those steps and reorienting our economic model in those kind of directions will prevent climate catastrophe, but I'm pretty sure that without attempting that kind of transformation, that kind of engagement with economic ideas, our failure is surely guaranteed.
Thank you very much, Simeon. Despite that last sentence, I found it a very helpful but no, I found it a very encouraging and hopeful paper. Finally, this morning, we're going to hear from Victoria, who, interestingly, very different perspective, very different angle at it, but it has some interesting parallels and synergy with the two papers we've heard this morning already. So thank you, Victoria.
Synergy is coming through my head there. All of these actually interesting. I don't know how to describe my paper. Maybe kind of creative rage. But I called it A Scapegoat Named Hope: The Absence of Hereth from Capitalist Land Detachment and the Need for Samud. So I'll explain all of these terms. Basically, I read, so one of the biggest things about the climate movement is the failures. They say it has a massive failure to attract the working classes. The climate movement is a very professional class kind of area, so students, people who are working in NGOs, leftist politicians, the working class aren't involved in it at all. So I started doing some reading, I picked up all of these books and I was trying to work it out, and I sat down to write and I wrote something completely different, which I think actually maybe, is a good thing. So I grew up on a council estate in Cardiff, in Wales, and recently, a couple of weeks ago, there were uprisings in Ely, and I heard a television AM radio interview between two guys, and they were talking about the damage that these kind of riots do to communities and the way that it tarnishes young people. And they went back to the bread riots of 1991 in Ely, which apparently was started because one shopkeeper was arguing with another one about who was allowed to sell bread, and one was from Pakistan and one was white. But that wasn't the reason. The reason for these bread riots were because of the absolute deprivation that are in these areas in Wales. So we can go back to Thatcher and the mines closing. So in 1985, the miners' strikes ended. And I mean, the myths of why that mines had to close is kind of still accepted, but actually Wales was the most efficient mine in the world. Now, I'm not in a climate consultation saying, oh, we should stop mines. Like, that's not what I'm trying to say. But actually in 1984, 100% of people in these mining towns supported the strikes in Wales. And this is very different to the north of England, where it was about 30-something% supported it. This is because this was our only trade. So, but when the mines started to decrease, like the petitions were, the future of your pit is your young people. If you don't train your young people, you've had it. But these people didn't care about the economic sustainability of the mines. They cared about their trade, because their trade was the reason for their being. Their reason for being was the land. South Wales existed because of the coal. There's that relationship which was so important. So when these closed, if we go to Ely in 1991, Cardiff, the capital of South Wales, the city where the £30 million deal was signed because of the coal, had a massive economic downturn, and 30% of young men were unemployed in Ely in 1991. So on the back of these riots, you know, the conservative people call them yobs, and it was, you know, the young people, they just don't have any, and like they don't have any passion for work, you know, they're lazy. Whereas the Labour MP were like, no, we need to look at this a little bit closely. And one of the lines he says is, there's no real hope. Fast forward to 2023, it's exactly the same situation. So I kind of wanted to go into these arguments a little bit, and probably just got distracted, but I kind of came up with two paradigms. And so one's taken from your Grego, and it's the Capitalocene. So we've got the Capitalocene, and the church is investing in the Capitalocene. And I want to convince the church, with all of its power, because we actually have a lot of money, and a lot of power comes with money, we need to be investing in the dirty. I'll explain a little bit about what I mean. So the issue, I think, with South Wales is I see that we've lost this idea of hiraeth, which is a Welsh word that is like a longing for like a longing for something that was or has been, but it's so like entangled with the land and with Wales. And so I'm thinking about places where these people live, is they're like trapped in concrete jungles. Okay, where am I going? Oh, I got lost. I wasn't going to talk about that yet. Okay, so never mind, I'll go back to you. Okay, so Capitalocene is this idea of, so your Grieger kind of talks about it in one of his books. And so he explains that the Capitalocene is the geological age where the maximization of economic profit has made it to the center stage all over the globe and dominates whatever other ages have been proclaimed, including the Anthropocene. The economic interests of a small and privileged group of humans rule both people and planet. So we're thinking about the 1%, right? This idea that trickle-down economics in no sense work, okay? So Alan Bozak calls this a global apartheid. And then how neo-capitalism is a corrupt system that mocks the concept of work, right? So the idea that hard work will get you anywhere. In the States, anyone can be a president, right? This is a gaslighting technique that's spewed by billionaires who are readily exploiting people and the land for their selfish money, for their selfish profit, right? So this is a far cry away from these Welsh miners who put so much pride in their trade and work. And hopelessness is rife in the struggling areas of Wales, okay? So Laura Waddell's written a really good chapter about growing up in a council estate in Glasgow, and the idea that sweet treats like a chocolate bar or a can of Coke, they were like escapism. And so these council estates, like grey collective areas of concrete, badly serviced by public transport and rising poverty, the escapism now, I think, has gone beyond fast food and its technology. So Bong Chong-Hel talks about how we are today experiencing the transition from the age of things to the age of non-things. So information rather than things determine the life world. So we no longer dwell on the earth and under the sky, but on Google Earth and the cloud. So smart, man. So like, I think we're all infomaniacs, but we're not actually getting any smarter. We're just consuming. So my partner loves walking. He went on this walk in Wales, and he had a friend from London come with him. And an hour into this 7-hour planned walk, his friend was like, "Can you take some selfies? Can you take some photos of me?" And he was like, "All right, should we go home?" I don't know, we've got 6 hours left. But what else this infosphere does is it has this emancipatory effect which liberates us from the hardship of work. So where the tool is the extension of the hand, right? So if you're using a hammer, you're getting blisters. We transfer our intellectuality into the place which holds the infosphere. So Bungtung House says the hand is the organ of work and action. The finger, by contrast, is the organ of choice. They choose rather than act. They push buttons in order to satisfy their needs. Their lives are not dramas in which they are compelled to act. Their lives are play. So play doesn't really see itself in reality. Play doesn't resist, and play doesn't work. And I think this idea maybe of hope is not helpful when we're communicating to the working classes about the climate catastrophe. Because, why did this go back? Because I think the middle class hope of climate catastrophe is just feeding into the infosphere. So like sending Boris Johnson on a private jet to a climate consultation in Cornwall. How is that relating back to the way people are living and that inability to work and their inability to be with the environment and to have their relationship to a place? Like petitioning our greedy government is almost kind of becoming clickbait for journalists. And I really feel like I've got to a point where I don't think we have any hope and influence in the Capitalocene. So the idea of money running around in circles in the air where no one can touch, money controls money. So this middle-class prosperous language of writing, researching and debating is not helping those who want to use their hands to provide for their families. So how ironic is it that these groups can speak of the need for hope when they have the means to easily provide for their families, money to buy produce from the market chains, a car to find the best produce, and outside space to grow their own vegetables. So my nan and granddad were the first residents on this new council estate where I grew up in Cardiff. It was a place they chose to retire. And I just had this image of my nan continuously, so she died last year, like growing flowers in her garden where everyone around them kind of didn't care about, or they didn't have the energy, they didn't have kind of the realization to care about the environment. And so obviously our prosperity comes from cooperation. So I'm trying to work out how we can help the working classes who are denied their ability to work with their hands to get on board with the hope of the middle classes. Then I was thinking about Palestine, and if anyone's been to Palestine in the West Bank, you'll see there's like rubbish everywhere, like litter everywhere. And their detachment from their land, I think, stops them being able to do their everyday stuff because there's so much to resist. But they have a word called samud, which is like steadfastness. And I think samud is much more helpful than hope because samud is like work in the face of people who would rather you not work because it's easier to forget that you exist. So my point then was that why is the URC, with all of our money, investing so much in the Capitalocene when, let's be honest, the church is declining and it's not going to get any better with how it's working right now. So what are we accumulating money for? And I think me and some of the other younger generations are thinking that we're just going to be left with huge trust funds, and like, I don't want to manage that. So can we stop investing in the Capitalocene, and can we invest in the dirty, in council estates with people who aren't prosperous, with people who aren't going to develop the Capitalocene? And my dream is, can we get to a place where empty shelves on Tesco don't, like, the working class people don't even notice it because they're being provided for from their own kind of like gardens and vegetable patches and spaces. And what a legacy for a church, a congregational church that's come from the working class tradition. What kind of legacy would that be if we reinvest in these dirty places which are not prosperous for the Capitalocene?
Thank you so much, Victoria. I loved in your paper when you talked about investing in the dirty, you use the word risky. We hear, even within our own church congregations, we want to invest in this account because the returns are high. It's like it's safe, and it's like, what are we doing? What is this about? You know, and we can't take a risk. Actually, I think we're at the stage where we absolutely need to take risks, don't we? I felt that with all three of your papers, I love the fact that all three had very clear ways forward at the end. And I think that's where I found the hope in your papers, the encouragement in your papers. I think the fact that, Simeon, you focused on the fact that change is possible, and that restraint is one of those, and that we need to find sort of joint goals. Richard, I loved your point about winning hearts and minds, and I think I use my hands rather than words sometimes, but that bringing people with us rather than telling people what to do. It's just, how do we bring people with us? And Victoria, that, you know, remembering who it is we're leaving out, and instead of criticising them, working with people and finding out what it is that they need. We do actually have very limited time, but I did want the three of you to maybe have a conversation between yourselves. If there's anything that you wanted to pick out from each other's papers before we opened it out, because there was quite a lot of connection between the three. And I just wondered if any of you had questions for each other.
I'm not sure if there's a question or not, but and one thing that struck me was the question of poverty and inequality, which is not measured in GDP. GDP can rise, you know, with less equality or more equality. And obviously your point about the how are people in Ely going to get concerned about climate change when they're concerned about just day-to-day living is, I think that's central to it. And the thing I referred to and I was trying to make is that because of the threat, particularly to coal, to fossil fuel communities, I mean, basically in Britain that's mostly gone, and we have the legacy of that is, I think it's about 8 to 10% of the population living in the coalfield communities, with severe deprivation, probably 2 generations on from when they were closed, you know. And that's the threat that faces coal areas in South Africa and in Czech Republic and Poland. So there are real, you know, these are real challenges. They're not just obviously numbers. They're not just, you know, oh, we'll just create, you know, fewer jobs there and more jobs there, and it will balance out. Well, those are not the same people. That's my kind of the take I get. So to me, that's, you know, we can talk about financial vested interest, but that is the reason why governments, you know, will not move or may not move.
And it points to the importance of not only transitioning away from our current fossil fuel dependence and the kind of economic models that I was talking about, but doing that in a way that is just and brings justice with it. You can see already the political fault lines developing up around the net zero target. There was, you know, the front page of the Sunday Telegraph, I think, on Sunday had 2 stories which both were sort of such a kind of warning shot across the kind of the dividing lines for the next election around you know, net zero is putting £200 on everyone's bills. So let's move away from that now. And you know, I see, if you've got nothing, then that's a really appealing thought that we have to save 200 quid on our electricity bills. But that's just obviously not going to help anyone in the long term. But this is becoming a dividing line. What I really appreciated, Victoria, in your paper was the pointing to where we might invest in alternatives. So I think that's one of the themes that we've been exploring over several days, is, you know, how can we, recognizing we're living within this system, also start to live the new ways. And I think you point to some of the opportunities to do that in a really exciting way. I'm not sure dirty investment is the headline that I would go out when we're still trying to get rid of fossil fuels, but yeah, I know exactly what you mean. So,
I'll leave a different one. Simeon, I like your point about it's our responsibility as humans and Christians to like restrain ourselves and our resources. Yeah, I have a point and I've forgotten it. Yes.
We can come back to it, Victoria. We'll invite some comment and
oh no, I had it. we're not realizing anymore that, like, in no sense are we talking about how they're God resources. It's the capitalists who own the companies that we believe own the resources, right? So we're thinking of the water catastrophe and that there's literal poo in our water, and we're like, oh, it's because these companies need to make a profit. Like, no, it's not their water, it's our water. We're employing them to manage the water for us. And I just think we've got lost a little bit on the idea that we can own these kind of resources.
Yeah. Ownership or stewardship. Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody in the room like to ask a question or make a comment on anything you've heard this morning? Thank you. All right.
Yeah, can I ask a question, which is a variation on the question I asked Anna about Jesus linking economics of the temple, etc., with Satan. And I gathered from her response, she heard this as, oh, this is some white guy trying to argue that we don't need to pay reparations. And I wasn't at all. What I'm really concerned about is what Simeon raises in his paper as the spirituality of economics. And it seems to me that the part of our economic system takes so much for granted that what we need to do is to operate it better and in a more kindly fashion. Whereas Jesus talks about the spirituality of money in terms of addiction and idolatry and things that chain us and hold us and cut us off completely from God. And to me, so much of the discussions, and I'm not saying this is not a criticism of your paper at all, Simeon, but a lot of economic discussions that we hear in churches. Take an example of if it's addiction, what are the parallels with, say, alcohol? All the discussions about the spirituality of money and economics are at the level of how do we regulate pubs in their hours, and how, you know, what's a measure of wine that's going to be sold at the pub. Whereas what we really need to be doing is something akin to a 12-step program that helps addicts recover. And it's, you know, this is where I think it touches maybe Richard's and Victoria's papers as well, is part of our persuading people about the climate crisis that we're facing and how to do something. Is there something there about persuading them about how deeply trapped we are in our economic systems? You know, that when people begin to see the ways in which we are colonized and addicted to this economic things as consumers, you know, we begin to open up a sense of crisis that affects the world, but also us very personally. It brings it back home.
Thank you very much, Florence. That's, yeah, very interesting perspective. And addiction has run through a lot of the conversations we've been having over the last 48 hours, and some of them informal conversations over meals, but it's been an interesting thread that's been running through. Thank you.
We have one question, lovely, from the...
Fantastic. So can you read, who's, excuse me.
Val.
How the Old Testament concept.
Val, would you like to ask your question directly?
Okay then, hello everybody, and thank you for your presentations this morning. My question was, could I ask the panel what they think about the Old Testament concept of Jubilee?
Who would like to?
Yes.
Yes.
I think, you know, I think it's got a lot to teach us, and there's a lot of wisdom in it. The wisdom that the land is God's at the end of the day, the wisdom that all of our wealth comes from what's given by God, and the wisdom that injustice can spiral unless you have these reset mechanisms periodically.
Yes, yes. It limits the deterioration of inequality and so on. It sets things back. Yeah. I mean, obviously the debt forgiveness, the Jubilee 2000 debt forgiveness campaign was directly inspired, and that seems like a really obvious modern parallel to that. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Val, for your question. Any further comments or questions to our speakers?
I've got a question. The problem is, I haven't read all the papers, so you might have talked about it sort of thing, but it sort of ties in with addiction that you were saying, Lawrence, I think, and I've been unaware of it. So, and what you were saying about was it guardian, so I found it hard to understand some of your accent. Sorry. So, so one of the things in New Zealand, and this is, I'm not articulating this very clearly, but it seems to be that leisure is the new kind of part of it. It's actually been sucked in by the empire that's trying to use the terminology. So that when you build a house in New Zealand, you don't have a garden to be able to provide for yourself, because leisure has been lifted up as a status thing. So you spend all weekend doing your leisure, which is, I guess it's fair enough if you work hard, 9 to 5, etc. But then what happens to something as simple as growing your own potatoes, or, you know what I'm saying? So I'm just wondering if was sort of sucked in, people got sucked in, even the leisure has been empirized.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Commercialized.
Yeah.
And I don't know what it is. I'm not a football fan, but if you were to do something with football, you'd probably get shot, wouldn't you, in the United Kingdom?
I don't know about New Zealand, but in the UK, what's our favourite leisure activity? Shopping.
Shopping.
Shopping for plastic, and then you put it in the bin the next day.
And it's just that endless consumerism and consumption that we're
I think there are two things as well. There's that we're not seeing our environment as a solution to our problems. So the solution to our problems is to grow the economy so we can get more produce, blah, blah, blah. Like we're not seeing, like we're looking up, we're not looking down, we're looking to the capitalism, like there's accumulation of money that never actually rains into our hands, rather than looking at what we've been divided from where the answer, that we're standing on the answer, right? But like that's it's not a solution to the problem, when obviously it should be. So we're not looking at investing in like you were saying in the EU. Actually, the EU should be subsidizing like renewable energy for people, like that makes sense. We're investing in our land, but we're not doing that. I think the second thing is that capitalism constantly, I think for the working classes, constantly exhausts people. So people, for instance, who are unemployed, the constant austerity, the need for them to get a job, all of the restrictions on them not having food actually doesn't leave. I don't think we have capacity for leisure anymore, because work never stops. We're like always kind of working. So I think that's another thing I'd want to touch on as well.
Yeah, so you're too tired to do your garden. And if you're going to do sport, then you've got to be successful at it. You know what I mean? So you've got to do a sport which takes you away all weekend in your car and with the push bike running over mountains, which looks great. But they don't even see the beauty of what they're running through because they're so busy running through it.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all those who've contributed to this discussion. Really grateful for your time in producing your papers and also for being with us to talk about them this morning. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.